Welcome to Talking Feds, a roundtable that brings together prominent former federal officials and special guests for a dynamic discussion of the most important political and legal topics of the day. I'm Harry Littman. We continue with our series of subject-specific episodes designed to analyze and prepare for the assaults on democracy that are on the horizon with Trump's second term. Our focus today is national security, Trump's instincts to reshape that area into a personal instrument of loyalty to him pose profound risks to the safety of Americans and the global order. We got a mild preview of the damage Trump may wreak in his first term when he routinely abused virtually all the rules, laws, and norms that govern national security, culminating, of course, in an orgy of violations as he left the White House with hundreds of purloined classified documents. That blatant misconduct led to an open and shut case, one that Judge Eileen Cannon and the American electorate allowed him to sidestep. Now he's back and seemingly even more cavalier. Most ominously, he's proposing to install Kash Patel as director of the FBI. Recall that when Trump tried to make Patel deputy director first time around, then Attorney General Bill Barr said, "Over my dead body." And if Trump is able to install Patel as director, Patel has assembled his own list of so-called deep state enemies he intends to target. Names like Kamala Harris, Robert Mueller, and Merrick Garland. Patel is not the only threat to the institutions of national security that Trump's government makeover threatens. Trump has indicated he will nominate Tulsi Gabbard to serve as Director of National Intelligence. Gabbard's troubling record, marked by an affinity for adversaries such as Russia and Syria, has already led nearly 100 former officials to urge the Senate to conduct closed-door hearings on her. To unpack the potentially catastrophic developments we now face for the 37,000 FBI employees operating in nearly 200 countries, for the broader national security function of the government, and most critically, for the safety and security of every American, we turn to three familiar, seasoned, and incisive national security experts. And they are Frank Figliuzzi, a former assistant director for counterintelligence at the FBI, where he served 25 years, including as special agent in charge of the Cleveland Division. He's now an MSNBC columnist and senior national security and intelligence analyst for NBC News and MSNBC. He's the author of The FBI Way, Inside the Bureau's Code of Excellence, and the super interesting, we covered it in a previous Talking Book episode, Long Haul, Hunting the Highway Serial Killers. Frank Figliuzzi, it's been a while. Thanks so much for joining.
Harry, thanks for inviting me, and thanks for the shameless promotion of my books.
Yeah, not shameless at all. I read it. You guys should read it. It's good.
It's great.
And speaking of a prolific writer, Juliette Kayyem, a national security analyst at CNN, the faculty chair of the Homeland Security Program at Harvard's Kennedy School, and a contributing writer at The Atlantic. She was President Obama's assistant secretary for intergovernmental affairs at the Department of Homeland Security. She's the author of two books, Security Mom and The Devil Never Sleeps, Learning to Live in an Age of Disasters, and you're at least outlining a third. Are you not, Juliette?
It's all right here. Yes.
All right.
Yes.
Okay. Well, we're going to try to get some of it. And Asha Rangappa, a senior lecturer at the Yale University's Jackson School for Global Affairs, a legal contributor for ABC, and a former associate dean at the Yale Law School. She also was previously a special agent in the FBI, where she specialized in counterintelligence investigations. She substacks at the Freedom Academy with Asha Rangappa, and she's been killing it of late. I really recommend it highly. Asha, so nice to see you.
Thank you. I'm excited to be back.
All right. Welcome to our nightmare. Trump's announced plan is a two-step, each one, I would say, horrifying in different ways. Let's start with just the prospective firing, which I think is part of any plan to change the FBI head of current FBI Director Chris Wray. So a lot of important officials, including law enforcement officials, are replaced at the beginning of an administration. Not so much the FBI head. Why is Wray's potential sacking so consternating? And I'll just add what David Frum wrote in The Atlantic. Firing of Wray is the real outrage. The obnoxious nomination of Patel slathers frosting and sprinkles on the outrage. So do you agree? Let's just focus on Wray's being fired and why is it a harbinger of bad shit?
I don't know whether it is the outrage or the primary outrage, because these days it's getting harder and harder to get outraged because there's outrage occurring every day. Trump will likely become the first president to fire 2 FBI directors. Why is that so bad? Because despite the fact that all we've heard from Trump is that the FBI has been politicized, the reality is that firing FBI directors before their 10-year term is up is actually the ultimate politicizing of the FBI. There's a 10-year term for a reason. The FBI director is supposed to straddle administrations, not be responsible to a certain party or person in the Oval Office. So we have an FBI director. He's not done yet. He's about 7 years in, I think, to his term. And it's yet a breaking of another norm that we're going to have to get used to, because the norms are going to be broken for the next 4 years.
Before Trump became president, the only other FBI director who had been fired was by Bill Clinton. It was William Sessions. There was a problem, I think an ethics problem. Frank might know the details. Think about that. I mean, I don't recall that in detail as it happened at the time, but I suspect there was a lot of justification, right, that was given because it was so far, it's a departure from the norms. And can I just add, Trump appointed Wray. This is his appointee.
Yeah.
It's so dumb. Like, he appointed this guy, and what we have now is James Comey, who was there when he first took office, wasn't loyal enough. Christopher Wray, not clear to me. I guess it's just he's not doing the kinds of investigations that he thinks he should be doing. So, yeah, here we are.
I think there's 2 cardinal sins that Wray's done, at least. One, he had the audacity to say on the Hill repeatedly that January 6th was an act of domestic terrorism, number one. That wasn't falling into place as Trump wanted. Number 2, of course, he presided over an FBI that had agents detailed to the Mueller Russia investigation. And that's the cardinal sin number 1.
I think if there's any silver lining, I'm going to go way back, which is the tendency of Democratic presidents to feel like Republican appointees do something for them. We always do this. We are like, Secretary of Defense, let's keep Gates. I mean, it infantilizes us as if we can't take on these responsibilities. So Obama chose Comey, right? And this is where it all begins, right? I mean, I believe that the Comey decision vis-a-vis Hillary Clinton that then begins this process of not trust, politicization, whatever else. So I'm going to look for silver linings. And I think that's one of them, is that we really have to go back to Comey in terms of whatever he's concocted in his mind about what it is that Comey did, right? Like there's no way you can look at this now over a decade later and think that his insertion into a political campaign, which then ultimately resulted in the election of Donald Trump, maybe it's not a direct line, which then ultimately starts a process by which, the FBI is investigating a very corrupt human being who happens to be president of the United States. So if Democrats ever get a chance to pick an FBI director, I mean, that is one lesson learned. But I think Frank and Asha are right that we sort of are so shocked by the appointee, we forget that there's a incumbent. And the 10-year rule was for 2 reasons. One was you didn't want them coterminous with the president. This is often true of military positions, Coast Guard, head of Secret Service. You just want someone in there who's a functioning adult who can manage an important agency. But the other was Hoover stayed too long. Right. And so part of the 10-year thing was there was no good way to get rid of him. He stayed too long. He was not adapting to, he was reactionary and going after civil rights people, but he was not reacting to the very society that he needed to adapt to, which included the rise of federal civil rights laws that needed to be investigated, the rise of consumer rights laws that need to be investigated. So that's the other reason for the 10-year rule.
As you say, Juliette, if in the future Democrats appoint someone, whoever's in that seat when it's coming up to an election, and depending on who's running, may well be thinking that his job is not secure, and that's really trouble. But second, in terms of the erosion of norms, right, you named three now. Sessions is fired probably for strong ethical reasons. Then Comey is fired for shitty reasons with a trumped-up memo, but at the time, Trump at least feels he's got to say something. He sets up Rod Rosenstein to, he believes he has to at least paper over the argument for cause. Now we're at a point where doesn't even seem to be a mention. If Patel's going to go in, that means Wray is going to go out. And I know of no argument even proffered on the other side. We had this morning Mike Davis say anyone tries to mess with Patel, they're going to be in big trouble politically. But literally, the law is, and the norm certainly is, you need cause. And I don't even know what the argument is.
I'm glad you gave that background, because what I was going to say is the through line that Juliette mentioned and that you're also referencing really should give us a touchstone for how, like, the boiling frog syndrome that we have been in. Right? I mean, do you guys remember the day that Comey was fired?
Yes.
My phone blew up.
Right.
It was so unthinkable. I mean, it resulted in the opening of an obstruction of justice investigation. I mean, think about how much was there.
Yeah, at the time they were talking 25th Amendment, right?
25th Amendment and I mean, it was all on the table. And the crazy thing now, in addition to the fact that, we've been sitting in the boiling water or the increasingly warm water for, this long, is on top of that, you have the SCOTUS decision, which at this point, even if it were fired for completely obviously corrupt reasons, there would be nothing you could do about it.
This is why I would, if I were ever advising Chris Wray, which I'm not, I would say, hey, don't resign.
Don't resign.
Don't resign. I agree.
Well, we'll play that out a little bit. Don't resign right away. When the letter comes over from the White House counsel saying, thank you for your service, goodbye, then do what? Because you're right. He's got this Trump is unique here in setting up a stark conflict between duty to institution and Constitution and supposed duty to Trump. So what are you referring to other than waiting for the firing order?
As we've said, there's no real legal grounds, unfortunately, for him to say, I have a 10-year term, you can't do this. He's already done it. And just add it to the long list of things that need to get fixed, as a result of learning from a corrupt president where we've made assumptions that norms would be followed. But no, just a matter of principle, Harry, that, you're going to have to fire me because you're going to have to yet again show people that you're politicizing this organization.
As we all sort of figure out what does Trump 2 mean in terms of people who are critical of him? How do you keep attention on what's important? How do you not get distracted by the noise? All of us are figuring this out on a personal and professional level, I'm sure. But one of the things that, as Frank raises, is one tool available is just create friction for him. I mean, he'll ultimately win. But I don't see any point at this stage I don't know who benefits if Wray resigns. I mean, it's just create the friction.
It's Timothy Snyder's don't obey in advance. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Don't obey. It's the defense side of that, which is just create friction and make it harder for people who will not listen to that friction or will put a bulldozer over that friction, but create it.
The other thing that I don't really hear people talking about is the deputy director position, because I think many people thought Kash Patel was going to be the deputy director. But the deputy director throughout history has been a career agent, usually very respected, lots of experience under their belt, really runs the day-to-day operations of the FBI. There's a lot of talk now that, the deputy director is going to have to go. I don't know if he's eligible for retirement or not. I think he is. But again, another person who should say, no, you're going to have to fire me.
It's interesting. This is totally an aside, but I mean, all of us are around young people. Asha and I both teach. I thought I would say to my students, get the hell out. I'm not saying that. I am literally like, my career students, the students who get public policy degrees and are a GS something at the Pentagon doing whatever for the same reason. It's not an internal resistance. It is just, I don't want to, at this stage, hand over everything, right? And I think that's worth it.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about that. And when Gates was nominated, I just reported as a fact that I talked to a lot of people who were like, I'm out of here. Let's assume for the moment that this all happens. What's the upshot for the rank and file agents and others in the Bureau?
I think we should first look at the selection process here of how agents get in. I mean, right now, it's a highly bureaucratized process to ensure extensive vetting, to ensure fairness. It's based on the needs of the Bureau, based on the threat landscape that we see at the time. I went in after 9/11 and I was expedited because I had language skills, because after 9/11, they decided that that's what they needed. That was also the time of anthrax. My Quantico class had a biologist, a chemist, a rocket scientist. It's very methodical. If these people leave, it's creating a bigger vacuum. And I don't see, Frank, you can tell me, that whole vetting process is internal. There's nothing that requires it. I suppose the director could be, Trump pardons the January 6th defendants and they get hired at the FBI and become 1811s. I don't think there is anything that could stop that.
Yeah, not really. I did this kind of research on a similar but different issue, which was, hey, isn't it a law that says the FBI has to do background investigations on White House nominees? And the answer is it's not really a law. It's a series of executive orders and memos. Similarly, with regard to any government employee, yes, there is CFR regulations. There's suggestions that everybody with a clearance is supposed to have some kind of background investigation. And it lays out, should go to veracity, finances, reputation, competency, blah, blah, blah. And so stuff like that will still have to be done, maybe, but you can easily start looking for different metrics for someone's criteria and loyalty. Loyalty to who? Loyalty to the United States. What does that mean? Well, I'm loyal to the president. Yes, that is a deep concern of mine. And we're going to see different kinds of people potentially coming in the front door for sure, particularly once they hit management and then senior executive service ranks. There'll be tight control over that. I have an even greater concern, and I hope this kind of rument is wrong, but there is chatter about replacing special agents in charge of field offices so that you have this kind of parallel MAGA where the U.S. attorney in the district is MAGA loyalist. Then somehow the guy or gal running the field office is also somehow a loyalist to Trump, whether that's in the form, I've heard horrible things about using deputized sheriffs and or police officers claiming that they're somehow federal agents and putting them in an oversight capacity in a field office. That's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, and of course, all the recipes really are being drawn up by people who just don't know a thing about FBI practice. And so even just the point you made, Frank, from the outside, it's, this is to get the most starchy Elliot Ness types. It isn't. People don't, understand that it's really the case that anyone who has classified information is targeted, and if there's any possibility of blackmail, it's serious stuff that underlies it. And I just want to make one more point about Trump and what he's doing here. He's got all three branches now basically under control, but there are pockets here and there, including the military, where he's doing something similar and having the possibility of ousting disloyal folks. And FBI is one of the few places you look to for a bulwark. This is happening in plain sight. He's announcing and executing authoritarian plans, and it does seem to be met from November 5th and since with basic indifference by the American people. Everyone looks to you guys for expertise. How do you sound the alarm and say, we're really not kidding here? What is to be done just to try to communicate to an apparently indifferent or fairly indifferent American people?
I just remind myself, this is me personally, but also professionally, and the way people like us may be helpful in the years ahead, where I think a lot of people feel very dejected. The Democratic Party, circular firing squad is ongoing and, until someone emerges with all the answers of what happened. So, just go back to the numbers. He's a wildly not popular president-elect who lost 4 years ago, and he's not Voldemort. He could have been stopped 4 years ago, and for that, I will never break bread with Mitch McConnell ever, because I do think that Mitch McConnell had that power, and we have to deal with this again. But the idea that we just have to stand by, he's going to bring a bulldozer. He does not have a mandate for that bulldozer. So one has to assume, as I do, that they still care about things like winning elections, or he cares about legacy, or his money people care about their money. And all of the various things will serve as a check. But we shouldn't start this January 20th with the idea that he has a mandate. And we have to tell ourselves that every day, because it's the truth. It's the truth. And he acts like he has a mandate because he doesn't.
I will add that we all work for different news networks.
Yeah.
And I think the media has to step up. They have really fallen down on the job. When you look at the news about Kash Patel and Hegseth, being eclipsed by this Hunter Biden pardon, like, dude, just freaking get over it. Like, yeah, he pardoned his son. Okay, we can have a conversation about norms, come, give me a break. Why is that back-to-back coverage right now? Like, there's a guy who has been repeatedly accused of sexual assault, whose own mom was like, you need to get it together, and has, a number of other serious problems, who may be in charge of our military. Like, how are these stories equivalent? It is just baffling to me. I think the media has just simply not learned how to cover Trump in almost like a decade.
Asha's absolutely on the money with regard to all of our employers and corporate media. That's unbelievable. But also, Harry, you asked the question, how do we approach trying to wake people up to the threats that we're facing with regard to these nominees? I'm increasingly convinced, mostly through my social media and responses to what I'm writing and saying on TV, that, again, about half the population either doesn't care or wants this. They want the breaking of the institutions. And so there's no way to convince them of the dangers until they start to experience it themselves or in their community. With regard to the FBI, when they start seeing corruption unaddressed because the mayor happens to be a Republican, or no more Russian spy cases are open because maybe the DNI, Tulsi Gabbard, has said we're not doing Russia anymore, and that means their factory closes because Russia stole their trade secret. That's it. That's unfortunately, when they empty out headquarters, if he does it, and there's no more tracking of global cyber trends and signatures or transnational violent crime gangs, and that affects your local problem, then maybe.
Or they themselves are the victims of some major fraud, and, the FBI doesn't give a shit because they're off prosecuting some journalists.
They're too busy doing Trump's work.
I'm of that school. I'm of the let it rip school. And because one, that does give the media something to focus on. In other words, it isn't the threat of Hegseth, right? Okay, that's hard to tell, whatever, even though I don't think he's going to get through. I think these, even in this world, these allegations are pretty bad. But you have an FBI head like that. You have a FEMA director that can't deploy resources. It's going to be the let it rip resistance. And I just made that up. I'm going to trademark it, but it is.
There's the book.
It's a very different type of engagement than I think Trump 1.0, which was the warning, and it didn't work. And we're all figuring out why that is, and the party is figuring out why that is. But it is, I think Frank's right. There has to be a story to tell.
Yeah, there will be stories, and that's sad where we are. I'll just add to the what's daunting about it is there'll be at the FBI level, there may be a corrupt mayor, but there'll be a lot of things that the FBI protects us from that we won't really know if there's a abandonment of. And then there'll be Trump. Trump will claim credit for anything good and put on Biden anything bad. So rhetorically. I felt this about Hunter. I don't want to incur Asha's wrath by talking about it for more than 10 more seconds. But I understood that, there's going to be these battle of sound bites. Of course, they're just wrong on the merits. They're not commensurate cases. All right, let's go to the other side. Kash Patel. Wow, you guys are the experts, but just strikes me as, the gates for the FBI, if anything worse, but that trifecta of not a lot of competence, really an arch loyalist who'll, do anything for Trump, and real hostility, even worse than I think Gates had. So let's just start here. I mean, do you see this? Does the national security see this as just two middle fingers from Trump?
Yes. And I think we need to really understand the latitude and power that an FBI director would have. People don't realize that we talked about norms earlier. The FBI is operating on a lot of internal norms and also certain rules which are promulgated by the Attorney General. The rules for investigations are not laid out in legislation. People need to understand that. They are promulgated internally by the Attorney General. They can be changed. They can be rescinded. This was the deal that was made after the Church and Pike hearings. You talked about Hoover. When you don't have those guardrails, what you have is the Hoover days. You have black bag jobs. You have running basically counterintelligence type of operations against domestic targets. All of these things that these rules are designed to prevent, to protect civil liberties, which if they're gone, you can be surveilled. This isn't just about when they finally bring charges in a court of law, right? I mean, there's a lot of investigative activity and tools that can be used to harass you, to intimidate you. Before then, there's surveillance. They can go through your trash. They can listen to your calls. They can do all kinds of stuff. And I think Frank can probably drum up more possibilities. And it can get very bad with somebody who is not willing to be what every director until now has been, which is a steward of the institution, right? Like somebody who understands that they are carrying like this mantle of something bigger than themselves forward. I mean, the same way that most presidents until now have had also.
It's not that he's not, carrying the mantle. He's going in there with grenades. He wants to basically rebuild the whole FBI, wants to purge the top ranks. It's not at all subtle, right?
No. I'm no fan of bureaucratic bloat and, overstaffing and all of that. I'm all for shaking things up. But, I keep hearing the Trump folks saying the word disruptor. Oh, we've got disruptors. This isn't disruption. This is destruction that we're talking about. And to our security, the peril of our security, he's not a serious person. He's not qualified, but that's the least of my concern. That's the least of my concern. It's ignorance. It's craziness. It's loyalty to Trump. Pursuit of enemies.
And yet enemies within, the desire to destroy. This is Gates, but worse. Yeah.
To Asha's point on the power and authority that's there and open for abuse. Yes. And there's things you can do even within the existing system that, for example, particularly after 9/11, things called threat assessments were labeled, and you have a list of things you can do within a threat assessment without a case being open. Then you've got preliminary inquiries where you don't even need specific and articulable facts to open a case. And you can develop informants. You can do a pen register. You can do a mail cover where you're looking at on the outside of people's mail to see where they bank and where the return address is. All of this can happen without a full-blown case being open. And we all applauded that because thank God we can get on top of threats right away and weed them out.
We're now in the prevention business.
Prevention, right.
But
now you look at it through a different lens and it's prevention, it's abuse.
Look, this guy's got an enemies list.
Yeah, I have friends. I have friends on that list.
Right. Yeah. So let me just ask you, by the time there's criminal prosecution, there will be due process, lawyers stepping up. But it's clear, is it not, that if all you're looking to do is just make, somebody's life miserable and drain them financially, there's a lot of ways to make trouble. Yeah. Can you just speak to that a little?
So under the guise of a threat assessment or even a PI or even, just intelligence gathering, after 9/11, the FBI stood up something called the Intelligence Division, which is about collecting intelligence for the sake of intelligence. And by the way, Patel has singled that out as a problem. That's interesting. Yeah, so you can make life miserable for somebody, surveilling them, getting phone records, interviewing people at their workplace and their neighborhood.
National security letters, getting their transactional information.
Yeah, how about calling them into a grand jury, ultimately realizing that this is going to go nowhere, but now you got legal fees. Now you're on the front page of the paper. Yes, life can be miserable for people. And then I will also mention extrajudiciously, there's a parallel track of just security and safety. If your name's on a list, and I just saw something about Trump wanting to sell T-shirts with people's names on that list on a T-shirt. Imagine the knuckleheads, dangerous knuckleheads that will come out and feel they need to take action into their own hands. Long track record of violent things happening, often, by the way, leading to law enforcement killing that person. The guy who tried to breach the FBI Cincinnati field office. Years ago, Cesar Sayoc out of Miami sending bombs to John Brennan and a bunch of others. The Clintons, the guy in Provo, Utah, who swung a rifle at FBI agents who were trying to arrest him. All of those people are out there, and all they need is a list of names to really cause potentially violent harm to people and their families.
Yeah. Can I say two things on these themes? The first is, this idea of the disruptor, right? So we break things. This is like the Facebook mantra, right? It's like you can only break things because there's a floor that you want to assume is unbreakable, right? So, we're not in the four of us are not in the break things world. We're also not billionaires, but that's okay. But we're not in the break things world. So this idea that what you're talking about in terms of space exploration or whatever else is, you don't want this safety and security to be broken, right? In other words, you don't want to create it. You don't want to create the chaos. It is actually, there's a reason why it never has abided by that mantra. And it's not because we're faceless bureaucrats. It's because most nations view this mandate as sort of a unified mission by any country, right? To protect the safety and security of its people from foreign and domestic threats. The other thing I want to say is just we're always talking about the things that they can do under him. And I'm of the same, so it's once you get past he doesn't have the temperament or the experience, then you get to the Patel he's going to have a lot of explaining to do in his hearing. And if the Democrats do this right, they may not win. They may not get any Republicans against it. But this guy is going to go in, once again, friction. You go in creating as much friction for this guy as possible, right? And I've only gotten a whiff of some of the things that he said. He's crazy. He is. He's it's like that Elon Musk sort of excitable thing. I don't know where that comes from.
There's some 13-year-old quality of just explosive, experimenting with dynamite.
He's like a, bro podcaster. But I do want to say, look, the FBI has power not through just commission, but also through omission. And I was on the DOJ side of what the two of them were doing for 5 years at the beginning of my career. I was on the civil side, so very different. But it was FBI investigators who are doing the voting rights cases, who are doing the civil rights cases, who are doing the lynching cases, who are doing three major cases I had at the beginning. VMI in terms of women, the Black churches burning, people will forget this. It was a major task force. And a case that was big at the time, most people don't remember it, but a school had canceled its prom because there was a biracial couple in Alabama, and then had separate proms. It was crazy. So the FBI supports and its failure to do that. So this is the acts of omission that we also have to be focused on. That in other words, they're not going to investigate thoroughly civil rights cases. If they're not going to investigate thoroughly national security cases, if the Republicans, public corruption, consumer fraud, all that stuff. Yeah.
How about excessive use of force by a police officer?
Yeah. Absolutely. Yep. That's going to be also just an area where he's going to have influence by just not driving the resources.
And just to make sure that people understand, Kash Patel, when he was floated as the deputy director of the FBI and CIA during the first Trump administration, Trump appointees were appalled.
Bill Barr said, "Over my dead body." Bill Barr.
Bill Barr was a loyalist. Bill Barr was willing to go to bat. I mean, he's, about as the president's personal lawyer as you can get. If he was like, are you freaking kidding me, Kash Patel? I mean, you have hit rock bottom, my friend.
Yeah.
I mean, there used to be this norm. We thought about it in 2017. Somebody runs a little crazy during a campaign, but then they settle down and bring in the adults from the professional class in Washington. This is literally, it's not only the absence of that, it's the complete opposite in a triumphant way. No, I'll show you your professionals.
One of it is the temperament issue. And I mean, these are serious jobs at levels in which it takes serious people. Issues come quickly. Decisions have to be made with imperfect information. And I never can get past, Hegseth and others, these are people who, when under pressure, drink, attack women. Like, how are they going to deal with the pressure? That's why I just talk about friction. Like, there's just, in crisis management, you read the book, we always talk about extending the runway until the catastrophe, right? Maybe it's just a lot of different kinds of friction in the system that can help at least guide leadership that is not built for this. These people are not built for this. I mean, over at DHS, I'm like, oh, thank God for her. I mean, she's, I don't like her policies, but she's run a state. At least I have some sense that she knows how to be a leader, right? This is Patel has been on podcasts from what I can tell, and he's written a few children's books.
He sells merch.
Yeah.
Kind of crazy merch.
Yeah.
And, by the way, one of the things in the Atlantic article, this is also something that I think is concerning, is that the people around him have said that he complains constantly that he doesn't have enough money. Now, you put somebody in charge of the frickin' FBI, which, sits on a trove of our national secrets that I assume any director can have access to at any time he wants. Being financially vulnerable is not really great. And so this kind of gets to that background check piece, by the way.
And as best you could tell, all these things are coming out that either they were incredibly brazen or just they were incredibly incompetent, being that all these things are now surprising even then. So somehow Trump's agenda is to actually just don't ask, don't tell about anything, including, as you say, palpable national security risks, right?
Yeah.
Shock and awe when it comes to the nominees, I think, rubbing everybody's face in it. I don't know for a fact that Hegseth was dishonest in the vetting process. That's supposed to be your time to break it all out, right? Hey, listen, I've got the following baggage.
That last question, anything? Yeah.
Anything else we haven't asked you about that's going to scare the hell out of us? And he either was dishonest about being kicked out of his own charity organizations, or being, having an alcohol problem that requires him to be physically carried out of events, multiple women, writing a check for a woman. Either that, he lied, which is bad, or they didn't care, which is bad.
I'm assuming that he, don't ask, don't tell. My understanding of some of these picks is like Donald Trump is on a plane. There's 6 names in front of him. This is a gate. Someone gets on a plane.
And Elon sitting next to him?
Yeah.
With Bobby Jr. eating hamburgers?
Yeah, where's John Jr. and where's Bannon?
I live in fear about whether I paid taxes on something 8 years ago. What I can't believe is knowing what he knows about himself, right? For Hegseth is a big deal. I mean, this stuff is crazy for a Secretary of Defense, for anyone, but particularly, okay, yeah, bring it on. I would be like, please don't pay attention to me.
Well, we all have been, but the notion that this is just more deep state stuff as opposed to, real implications for the national security.
And just so people know, what a background check would be looking for. And Frank knows this. I've written a Substack piece on it about the mnemonic that, FBI agents use, Carla F. Bad, right? So character, associates, reputation, loyalty, ability, finances, bias, alcohol and addictions, and drugs. These are all the points that you would want someone to look into for precisely the reasons that we are talking about, because either it makes them unsuitable for a position of public trust, untrustworthy, or vulnerable to exploitation by foreign adversaries.
Vulnerable to blackmail.
And by the way, the fact that these things are not coming out or are not being disclosed is itself a leverage point. I mean, this is a vulnerability because who knows what skeletons are buried by these other nominees that China and Russia can probably very easily get.
People don't appreciate it. It just takes one to do all kinds of damage, and it can last for years and can be very hard to uncover. You just have to be super conservative. When Getz was saying things like, well, they didn't indict me, it was just so head spinning. I mean, you've got to be risk adverse. And obviously the president-elect isn't that. So the question is, will we see that much even from a few Republican senators? All right, it is now time for a spirited debate brought to you by our sponsor, Total Wine and More. Each episode, you'll be hearing an expert talk about the pros and cons of a particular issue in the world of wine, spirit, and beverages.
Thank you, Harry. In today's spirited debate, we peek behind the wine label to see who lays claim to the best Chardonnay, California or Burgundy, France. As we've touched on before, wines from the U.S. are classified by the grape, while French wines are classified by the region. In France, the region of Burgundy produces some of the finest Chardonnays known as white Burgundies, which are almost always made from Chardonnay grapes. To put it simply, when you see a white wine from Burgundy, you know it's a Chardonnay. The cooler weather and cloud cover in Burgundy creates wines that have less of the rich fruit flavors you might find in a California Chardonnay. But what white Burgundies lack in fruitiness, they make up for in highly aromatic and complex flavors that range from tropical notes and crisp green apples to fresh jasmine and exotic spices. And you don't have to book a flight to France to taste them either. Just swing into your local Total Wine and More and ask one of our guides for a tour of our white Burgundies at a great value. Swinging over to California Chardonnays, you'll notice that they tend to be rich, full-bodied whites that have undergone malolactic fermentation and heavier doses of new oak. But that's actually a great thing, because it helps to create a creamy, buttery feel and flavors of butterscotch, vanilla, and ripe tropical fruits with medium acidity, which make for an ideal bottle. So when the mood calls for Chardonnay and you're torn between California and Burgundy, come talk to our guides at Total Wine and More, where it's always easy to meet in the middle and grab a bottle of each.
Thanks to our friends at Total Wine and More for today's A Spirited Debate. I wanted to talk a little bit more about national security and a couple other possible risky spots, like, say, Tulsi Gabbard is the Director of National Intelligence. Juliette gets a big smile on that, but, she would oversee 18 intelligence agencies, massive budgets. And if we take Asha's acronym, I'm sorry, for real reasons, she doesn't become a field agent. You're just too nervous about it. So what are your thoughts, especially having been in Homeland Security, and in particular, something we haven't talked about yet? Frank's mentioned the problem for the mayor in Peoria, but what about our allies in the cost to national security there? So thoughts, anyone?
I've never worked in the agents and the intel side. So this is just, but Tulsi Gabbard is a known entity. So the best story you can tell about her is that she's an idiot. I mean, that's your best evidence. She just is duped. And the more likely and worst story you tell about her is that she's for sale to our enemies, right? And I always go back to this it's not just that Syria visit, which was just sort of mind-boggling. Like, who paid for it? Who's paying for these trips that she's making? We've never been able to figure that out in terms of Syria. And that matters because she could be for sale. I'm going to raise something that I would be curious what Frank and Asha say, yes, our allies are going to be concerned, whatever. I worry less about the intelligence agencies in terms of their ability to adapt to this madness, partially because they're not as transparent as the other stuff. Then I worry about law enforcement and the FBI. I could be wrong on that, but I do think our allies are going to adapt if she makes it through, I think, in terms of the sharing of intelligence.
Frank alluded to something earlier, for example, like the ODNI can reallocate resources away from certain threats and towards others. And so if you were to just suddenly decide, and I think the ODNI can influence the CIA director, for example, to like, let's just pull all of our intelligence officers out of Russia because Trump promised Putin that we wouldn't spy on him anymore or something like that. Or we're going to go down on all of our FISAs on the Russian embassy or whoever, whatever country is, the highest bidder. So we're going to let them have carte blanche. I mean, I think even just in terms of not monitoring threats, not collecting information because that becomes a part of our foreign policy strategy for whatever reason, that will have a huge, huge impact on our national security.
It might, to the listeners, what Asha just said might sound kind of far-fetched and cavalier. We can just decide to go down on FISAs, not collect anymore on Russia. No, that's about as easy as it is. By the way, I've seen some of this happen in my career where, somebody said, I think this is a waste of resources. Literally, this happened to me one time. Some boss came in and told me I had a beer with this guy at this other agency, and we decided we need to do this, so make it happen.
Based on
how many beers did you have?
Yeah.
But that's how it works. So the DNI is not only a filter of intelligence to the White House, literally deciding what gets in the presidential's daily brief, but it's bigger than that. It's the shopping list they create throughout the year, throughout 5 years of we're all going to row in this direction. Here are the priority collection targets. And if she says Russia's no longer a collection priority, then it's not. If Trump plays golf with a Saudi prince and comes back and goes, hey, we're not bugging the Saudi embassy, are we? Boom, that's over. And look, we haven't even talked about, who is he going to put in charge of NSA?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And you say, Frank, 1 year, 5 years, but the hovering question, if we ever get to it in the Republic, if you can keep that way, is how reversible is this? Because especially in the national security realm, the trust among the 5 big agencies, it's just completely structural and solid, and nobody gives a shit who the president is or who isn't. But you get to a point now where people don't want to share with us or vice versa. And then 4 years later, does it just go away once they've seen the United States actually breach that way?
Harry, it is really not just about that. Like, the Department of Justice in the last year and a half has taken down 2 major Russian botnets that had taken over ordinary devices in people's homes and that were pre-positioned against our critical infrastructure. That's the kind of threat that the FBI and CISA and NSA are identifying so that people, their water supply doesn't get contaminated, so the electrical grid doesn't go down, that signals that, monitor our transportation lines don't get shut down. That's the kind of thing that we would be allowing our adversaries basically full range to do.
And thank you. I'm getting scared. People have this notion of the FBI as a deep state. Besides being false on the facts, it's just so benighted about all the things that are, they're part of American life.
As we're all going through our existential crisis of sort of how do you want to, so I keep asking myself, what? So what, now what? That's what I call it. And it's going to keep me from being distracted. What? So what, now what? Right? So
book title.
Yeah, no, I mean, I teach at the Kennedy School. We only do 3s. We can't do 4. It's too complicated. 2 looks like we're not trying, right? Yeah. So like 3. Yeah. But I do think about that in terms of what it is. So everything we're all saying is absolutely true because it's us, and absolutely has been unconvincing. So at least to a certain extent. So I don't mean that like me too. I mean, I've been thinking about this, but I'll tell you one area in this sort of overall national security thing. I mean, one is, look, I mean, I hate calling it the letter resistance because people will get hurt. But I mean, some of it is going to be the very things that Asha and Frank are laying out. When they do happen, people will then see the benefit, right? They need to see the benefit of government working. Where I think Trump's greatest vulnerability in this overall safety and security field is going to be in disasters. I am of the school Trump would have gotten a second term. It's a big but for COVID, right? I mean, in other words, Biden benefited in all sorts of ways because of COVID, including the fact that he didn't have to campaign really normally. So that if you're starting to look at how can we tell the story of government being meaningful in your life, the so what, because we failed on that. Like, I can't be clear about it. We just did. And it wasn't for want of trying by all of us, right? Like that's the so what I'm looking at. And it may be also things like what Asha was saying about things that touch people at home, right? In other words, if you can't get your water, that's a problem.
All right, we just have a few minutes left, and this isn't a silver lining, Juliette, but it is sort of a different point or a curveball, because there is within national security a fair bit of support for Trump. So an interesting part of this dynamic is going to be intra-agency and how that will play out. I don't have a good sense of it, and you guys haven't been there very recently, but is there crap going on to the best of your knowledge within the agency world as well?
Look, over the last several years, I've continued to marvel at the people I worked alongside in the Bureau coming out as Trump supporters. I'll never forget a couple of years ago watching someone who was a friend of mine I hadn't been in touch with for a few years. I saw him on Fox News. He was apoplectic about some conspiracy theories. I was in shock. My jaw just dropped open. So those people are there. There's a lot of retirees that are pro-Trump, and there's a lot of military veterans in the FBI. The Bureau deliberately, understandably, hires a ton of military officers, and many of them think this is fine with them, and waiting to see what happens.
All right, there's a not end, but a pause. I fear we will be back in too soon, but maybe we'll have a more mixed bag to be discussing, and I appreciate your valiant efforts in that regard, Juliette Kayyem. So thanks to everyone. It's been way too long, Frank, Asha, and Juliette, and hope we can reconvene early enough in the Trump era.
Yeah, I think it was good that it's been way too long. I think it's a sign of what happened that the three of us are together again.
Thank you so much, Frank, Juliette, and Asha, and thank you very much, listeners, for tuning in to Talking Feds. If you like what you've heard, please tell a friend to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or wherever they get their podcasts, and please take a moment to rate and review this podcast. You can also subscribe to us on YouTube, where we are posting full episodes, talking books, and more or less daily bonus video content. And this just in, Talking Feds now has a Substack. Check us out at Talking Feds Substack, where I'll be posting 2 or 3 bulletins a week, trying to break down the various threats out there to constitutional norms and the rule of law. You can still follow us on Twitter at Talking Feds Pod, and you can look to see our latest offerings on Patreon. Talking Feds is a completely independent production, so if you like the work we do and are inclined to support the show, joining our Patreon is the best way to do it. Thanks for tuning in, and don't worry, as long as you need answers, the Feds will keep talking. Talking Feds is produced by Catherine Devine, associate producers Gabriella Glick and Becca Havian, sound engineering by Matt McArdle, Rosie Don Griffin, David Lieberman, Hamza Mahendranathan, Emma Maynard, and Hallie Necker are our contributing writers, and production assistants by Akshaj Turbailu, Genesis Magpayo, and Sebastian Navarro. And our music, as ever, is by the amazing Philip Glass. Talking Feds is a production of Delito LLC. I'm Harry Littman. Talk to you later.